Good evening, class. Cody and I are excited to share what we have learned about layering, what it is, how to use it, and why to use it, including why layering is the best and most popular architectural pattern to use today.
So what is layering? Layering is the organization of programming into separate functional components that interact in some sequential or hierarchical way, with each layer usually having an interface only to the layer above it and the layer below it. It is the process of organizing information into related groupings in order to manage complexity and reinforce relationships in the information. Layering is sometimes referred to as tiered architecture or N-tier architecture because the number of layers or tiers represented by the N could be anything. It is one of the most popular architectural patterns today because making changes to a separate layer is easier than dealing with the entire architecture.
Three-tiered architecture. The simplest form of layering is three-tiered architecture. All layered software architecture contains three foundation layers: the presentation layer, the application layer, and the data layer. The presentation layer. This tier can be accessed through any type of client device like desktop, laptop, tablet, mobile, and so on. For the content to be displayed to the user, the relevant web pages should be fetched by the browser or other presentation component which is running in the client device. To present the content, it is essential for this tier to interact with the other tiers that are present preceding it. The application layer. This is the middle tier of this architecture. This is the tier in which the business logic of the application runs. Business logic is the set of rules that are required for running the application as per the guidelines laid down by the organization. The components of this tier typically run on one or more application servers. The data layer. This is the lowest tier of this architecture and is mainly concerned with the storage and retrieval of application data. The application data is typically stored in a database server, file server, or any other device that supports data access logic and provides the necessary steps to ensure that only the data is exposed without providing any access to the data storage and retrieval mechanisms. This is done by the data tier by providing an API to the application tier. The provision of this API ensures complete transparency to the data operations which are done in this tier without affecting the application tier.
So here's an example of a sales program, just a function from there. So in here we have the presentation layer, the logic or application layer, and the data layer. In this example, the user requests this function get sales total to get the total sales that they have made. So from here, the presentation layer sends that request to the logic tier. The logic tier then interprets that request and it gets a list of all the sales made. It generates that query and sends it to the data tier. The data tier then answers that query, going to storage if necessary to get the data. It puts it all together and sends it back to that logic or application tier. The logic tier then compiles that data, running whatever processes or function on it that may be needed in order to get it packaged up and ready to go so that it can be sent back to the presentation layer. Then the presentation layer takes that answer, that response back, and it presents it however it's been determined. It shows it what is needed. So for this example, you can see here there are the 4 total cells.
Layering in our project. In our family budget application that we have been designing as a class, we too can use a 3-tiered approach. We have the presentation layer that makes up the user interface. This controls all the display elements of the user. For example, the presentation layer is responsible for controlling the layout of reports and graphs that the user may request. The application layer handles all the logical processing. When a user requests a graph of their savings over the past 6 months, the application layer interprets that request and sends a query to the database. Once the database responds, the application layer sends the data back in the way the presentation layer is expecting it to. The data layer contains no processing or logic. It simply handles the storing of the data. When data is requested, it retrieves the data and sends it back. In this example, it pulls the amount of money the user saved each month over the past 6 months.
Okay, why use layering? So layering moderates the complexity of modern applications and makes it easier to work in a more agile manner. Each layer is separate, so it is easier to make changes to a single layer than the entire architecture of an application. Layering is particularly good for developing web-scale, production-grade, and cloud-hosted applications very quickly and relatively risk-free.
As awesome as layers are, there are a few disadvantages. In Chanu Kambalyal's paper, Three-Tier Architecture, he shares a few disadvantages. First is the structure of the code and development becomes more complex. The application becomes more difficult to set up and maintain, and the cost to set up a layered application can be high. The application becomes separated and often requires a more complicated installation. The back-end servers and systems can become more complicated as each one handles a different layer. With the data being separated from the application layer and the presentation layer, there can be latency and lag between the communication, affecting the overall performance of the application.
All right, so recommendations on using layering. Layering is the best. The short answer is almost always it's better to use layering. One of the ones that we had talked about was the three-tiered in here, very common one that you will see. After our review of the layering techniques, it's almost always better to use them. The benefits far outweigh the costs. Layering has been used for years and is the most commonly used architectural pattern because it is maintainable, scalable, flexible, and allows for faster development. By reading job postings, it seems that it is expected to understand this process. One of the most common examples of a three-tiered architecture is the MVC architecture, Model View Controller. This is commonly used with web applications. Most of the time we see this with the use of an API. There'll be an API or that application layer that controls how the information is retrieved from the database and presents it back in a way that the front-end developer can display the information in that presentation layer that the client would see. So Kate and I have had a lot of fun as we've been going through and learning about layering. Hopefully you guys have learned a little bit and can see the value of it. From here on out, I think each of us should look for opportunities that we can to develop in a layered or a tiered sort of an architecture. It seems like the benefits are really there. And thank you.